I offer to cancel all your debts for one night with you. These words fall like a whip upon Sarah. O'Brien, the indecent proposal from the county's most powerful man marks the beginning of her transformation. Widowed at 26, homeless and cornered by debts, Sarah faces a brutal ultimatum that will change her destiny forever. Submission or resistance, tradition or freedom. In a world where women are treated as currency, she discovers an inner strength more resistant than steel. When Victor Blackwell returns with gunmen to claim what he believes is his, he finds a completely different woman. One who no longer trembles in his presence. What happens when metal is exposed to the most intense fire? It transforms into something indestructible. Discover the heart of iron now. Subscribe to our channel, activate notifications, and leave us in the comments what you would do in Sarah's place. A story of rebirth that will leave you breathless until the last second. The sun slipped toward the horizon like a drop of molten copper, tinting the Texas sky with reddish hues that spilled over the headstones of the small cemetery. Sarah O'Brien, her black dress swaying slightly in the warm evening breeze, stood motionless before the newly settled grave. 3 months had passed since the earth had received the body of Daniel Martinez, her husband, victim of pneumonia that had settled in his lungs after exhausting days under the winter rain. At 26 years old, Sarah was already a woman who carried the weight of multiple farewells. Her fingers, roughened by constant work, caressed the withered petals of the flowers she had placed the week before. Mourning for her was not a matter of social convention, but an external manifestation of the desolation that inhabited her interior. "I'll return tomorrow," she whispered, though she knew her words would vanish into the air without any response. In that silence, she perceived absence as a tangible presence, as if emptiness had density and weight of its own. The wind swept away a rebellious strand of her chestnut hair, darkened even more by the evening shadows. Her eyes, of a deep green that recalled grass after rain, remained dry. Not because she lacked tears, but because she had learned from a very young age that crying didn't change destiny. She had learned it when the locomotive took her father, when tuberculosis consumed her mother, and now when fever had snatched Daniel from her side. With slow but firm steps, Sarah left the cemetery. The earth crunched under her boots, a sound that mixed with the distant song of crickets beginning their nocturnal serenade. The Martinez Ranch, her home during 10 years of marriage, rose in the distance as a reminder of everything built and everything lost. The first stars dotted the firmament when Sarah reached the worn wooden porch. The house, modest but dignified, seemed larger and emptier since Daniel's departure. Every corner held echoes of his presence. The chair where he sat to remove his boots after long days with the cattle, the hat hanging by the door, the pipe he would never light again. Upon entering, she lit the oil lamp that bathed the room with a golden, trembling light. On the table rested the wooden box containing the ranch documents, those that testified to both its belonging and its fragility. The debt of $3,000, contracted during the terrible drought of '87, weighed on the paper like a sentence. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee, the black and bitter liquid that had been her only companion during the long sleepless nights. Daniel would have insisted on adding a little sugar. "Life is already bitter enough, my dear," he used to tell her with that smile that brightened even the darkest days. But sugar was scarce like everything else. Her hands, small but strong, reviewed the yellowed pages of the contract. She had understood, even before Daniel, that the loan granted by Victor Blackwell was a skillfully laid trap. No one lent money during a drought without expecting something in return, something more valuable than simple monetary interest. But necessity had been greater than prudence, and the cattle were dying of thirst. "I'll find a way out," she murmured to herself, as a promise both to her late husband and to her own indomitable spirit. The lamp projected her elongated shadow against the wall, a solitary silhouette that seemed larger than she felt. Dawn surprised Sarah sitting in the porch rocking chair, her gaze fixed on the horizon that was tinting orange and pink. She hadn't slept. Nights had become hostile territory, where memories assaulted her mercilessly. She remembered Daniel telling her, during one of those starry nights so abundant in Texas, about the scar that marked his soul. As barely a child, he had witnessed how bandits attacked his father on the road to San Antonio. "I was paralyzed," he had confessed, his voice broken by a feeling he had never managed to name. I couldn't do anything while they beat him. I was 10 years old and I hid behind some bushes. His father had survived, but Daniel had carried that shame throughout his life, transforming it into a constant impulse to protect his own, to demonstrate a courage he felt he had once betrayed. That determination had led him to work without rest, even when sick, to pay off the debt to Victor. In the end, it wasn't a bandit who defeated him, but his own exhausted body. Sarah stood up slowly. The day demanded her attention, and she couldn't allow herself the luxury of self-pity. The animals needed to be fed, the garden tended, and she had to check the fence on the north side that threatened to give way to the next gale. Tasks that 4 hands once shared, and that now fell exclusively on hers. Life on the ranch had forged in her a resistance that went beyond the physical. Daughter of Irish immigrants, Sarah had learned from a very young age that survival was a matter of adaptation and perseverance. Her father, Patrick O'Brien, had arrived in America with dreams as big as his work capacity, only to find death under the wheels of a freight train. Her mother, Mary, consumed by sadness and tuberculosis, had barely survived 2 more winters. At 14, Sarah was already working at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, scrubbing floors and washing sheets. It was there she met Daniel, a cowboy with kind eyes who always had a gentle word for her. He had patiently waited for her to turn 16 before asking her to marry, a gesture she valued as a sign of respect in a world where young women were frequently treated as merchandise. Now, 10 years later, Sarah faced the world alone again, but she was no longer that frightened girl. Pain had molded her, as fire molds metal, transforming her into something more resistant, more defined, something capable of withstanding the blows of destiny without breaking. The sound of approaching hooves interrupted Sarah's evening routine. Since Daniel's death, visits were scarce, limited to some compassionate neighbor or pastor, Johnson with his well-intentioned but ineffective prayers. Victor, Blackwell dismounted with the studied elegance of one accustomed to everyone watching his movements. Tall, of distinguished bearing despite his humble origin, he had become the county's most powerful man through cunning and an absolute lack of scruples. His hair, black as a raven's wing, was beginning to show silver threads at the temples. The only concession to his 45 years. "Mrs. Martinez," he greeted, removing his hat with a courtesy that didn't manage to disguise the coldness of his gaze. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she remained upright. Victor's presence never augured anything good, and the envelope he held in his gloved hand confirmed her worst fears. "Mr. Blackwell," she responded with a minimal nod of her head. "To what do I owe your visit?" Victor smiled, a gesture that didn't illuminate his grey eyes. "Pending matters, I'm afraid. Business that your husband left, unresolved." The condescending tone inflamed Sarah, but she maintained her composure. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford in front of a man who held her future between those long, careful fingers. "Come in," she offered, more out of necessity than hospitality. The room, modest but impeccable, seemed to shrink before Victor's imposing presence. He took a seat without waiting for an invitation, spreading the envelope's contents on the oak table that Daniel had carved with his own hands the first year of marriage. "As you know, your husband requested a considerable loan," Victor began, pointing to the figure that jumped from the paper like an accusation. $3,000 plus accumulated interest over these 2 years. Sarah nodded. She knew every number, every letter of that document she had signed alongside Daniel that desperate afternoon. "When thirst was killing the cattle and the harvest was lost under a merciless sun, we have a payment agreement," she reminded him. 2 more years to settle the complete debt." Victor interlaced his fingers, a gesture Sarah had learned to identify as a prelude to bad news. "That agreement was with your husband, ma'am." Circumstances have changed. The silence that followed weighed like lead. Through the window, Sarah observed how clouds covered the sun, plunging the porch into a sudden penumbra that seemed to presage a storm. "I've bought all the outsea. Standing debts of the Martinez family," Victor continued, sliding another document across the table. "The Continental Bank has been very understanding with my offer." Sarah felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. The Continental Bank was the last institution that had agreed to give them a reasonable deadline for payments. If Victor now possessed all the documents, her situation was more than desperate. "Why would you do that?" she asked, though the answer floated in the air like a poisonous perfume. Victor leaned back in his chair. studying her with an intensity that made her feel naked and vulnerable. "I've always admired this ranch," he responded evasively, "and its occupants." The emphasis on the last word provoked a sudden nausea in Sarah. 10 years ago, when she worked at the boarding house, Victor had shown an interest in her that went beyond simple courtesy. He had tried to court her with gifts and promises that she rejected, choosing instead the young cowboy with the sincere smile and hands calloused by honest work. "If it's the ranch you want," Sarah said, keeping her voice firm despite the tremor that threatened to betray her, "we can negotiate a sale that covers the debts and allows me to start somewhere else." Victor's laugh, brief and humorless, resonated like a whiplash. "Negotiate? I'm afraid you're not in a position to do so, Mrs. Martinez. According to these documents, I have the right to execute the mortgage immediately." Sarah clenched her fists under the table. Desperation was beginning to give ground to a cold and calculating anger, the kind of anger she had seen in her father's eyes when Irish foremen were treated like beasts of burden. "So, have you come to evict me?" she asked, surprised by the calm of her own voice. Victor leaned forward, his grey eyes reflecting a hunger that had nothing to do with territorial power. "I've come to offer you a deal," he responded, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "One that could benefit us both." The offer fell between them like a stone in still waters. Sarah could keep the ranch if she agreed to spend one night with him. A simple, direct deal, brutal in its clarity. The proposal floated in the stale air of the small room, while outside, the first drop of rain struck against the window glass. Sarah had imagined many times facing adversity, but never in this way. The insult implicit in Victor's offer burned her insides. It wasn't only the indecency of the proposition, but the certainty that he had planned every move, taking advantage of her vulnerability like a patient predator. "I would rather lose everything," she finally responded, each word pronounced with the precision of a dagger. "I would rather live under a bridge than accept your offer." Victor's face hardened. He wasn't accustomed to receiving refusals, and even less from a woman he considered cornered. "It's a pity," he commented, collecting the documents with studiedly slow movements. "Daniel worked so hard for this place. Dying knowing that everything would be lost must have been his last thought." The mention of Daniel was like salt on an open wound. Sarah stood up, unable to contain her indignation any longer. "My husband died believing in honesty and hard work, Mr. Blackwell. Values you clearly don't know." Victor stood up as well, his figure casting a threatening shadow over Sarah. "You have 3 days to vacate the property," he sentenced, putting on his hat. "What you don't take by then will be auctioned to cover part of the debt." The door closed behind him with a slam that seemed to seal Sarah's fate. Outside, the rain intensified, pounding the roof as if wanting to tear it down. Sarah approached the window, watching as Victor mounted his horse and rode away under the downpour, becoming a dark silhouette against the grey landscape. Desperation threatened to drown her. But inside, something was beginning to change. Fear was giving way to a resolution that was born from the depths of her being. It wouldn't be the first time she lost everything, nor the first time she had to start from scratch. On the fireplace mantel rested the small locket that had belonged to her mother. Inside it held a lock of Mary O'Brien's red hair and a faded photograph of her father. Sarah took it in her hands, feeling its weight like an anchor to her heritage of survivors. "You haven't defeated me yet," she whispered, more to herself than to the ghosts that inhabited the house. The dawn of the 3rd day found Sarah with her bundle prepared, some clothes, the few personal objects she could transport, and her mother's locket hanging around her neck. The house had been left almost empty after she sold what she could to compassionate neighbors, obtaining barely enough to subsist for a few weeks. The destination was uncertain. Hill Station, the nearest town, offered few opportunities for a woman alone. The boarding house where she had worked in her youth now belonged to another family, and her reputation would be stained as soon as it became known that Victor Blackwell had stripped her of everything. With a last look at what had been her home, Sarah closed the door and began walking down the muddy path. The rain had ceased, but humidity persisted in the air, making her black dress stick to her legs. Mourning was now double, for Daniel and for the life they had built together. The sky was beginning to clear when she spotted the first buildings of Hill Station. The town still slept, with the exception of Marcus Stone's blacksmith shop, from whose chimney a greyish column of smoke already emanated. Sarah stopped in front of the establishment. Marcus was known for his skill with metal, but also for his condition as a free black man, in a place where such a condition still aroused suspicions. Daniel had respected him, even defending his right to establish his business when some neighbors tried to prevent it. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer on the anvil resonated from inside the workshop. Sarah hesitated for an instant before pushing the wooden door that gave way with a creak. Marcus lifted his gaze from his work. At 40 years old, his face showed the marks of a life of effort and resistance. His graying beard framed firm lips, and his eyes of a brown so dark they seemed black reflected a sharp intelligence. "Mrs. Martinez," he greeted with a slight nod of his head. The hammer now rested to one side of the anvil, but his hands, large and strong, continued holding the red-hot piece of metal. "Mr. Stone," Sarah responded, unsure how to proceed. "I apologize for the interruption." Marcus left the metal in the water, producing a cloud of steam that rose between them like an ephemeral veil. "Daniel was a good man," he said simply, as if that explained and justified any interruption. "How can I help you?" Sarah felt words catch in her throat. Pride fought against necessity, but it was the latter that prevailed. "I need work," she finally declared, "and a place to stay for a while. The ranch no longer belongs to me." Understanding illuminated Marcus's eyes. Rumors about Victor Blackwell and his methods were no secret to anyone in the county. "I have a room," he offered, pointing to a door at the back of the workshop. "It's not much, but it's clean, and there's always work here for willing hands." Gratitude flooded Sarah like a warm wave, unexpected amid so much coldness. "I don't know anything about blacksmithing," she admitted, embarrassed by her own ignorance. Marcus sketched a slight smile, barely visible under the thick mustache. "But you know about hard work, don't you?" Sarah nodded, remembering the long days at the ranch, the care of the cattle, the constant struggle against the elements. "Then you'll learn," Marcus concluded, returning to his anvil. "Iron is stubborn, but it yields if the right heat is applied and it's struck with determination." Those words, pronounced without pretension of wisdom, resonated in Sarah like a revelation. Perhaps she too could be molded by the heat of circumstances, transformed by the blows of destiny into something new, something stronger. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Sarah learned that blacksmithing was a complex universe, governed by the balance between strength and precision. At first, her tasks were limited to maintaining the fire, sorting tools and attending to customers who, after the initial surprise of seeing her there, began to accept her presence as part of the business. Marcus proved to be a patient but demanding teacher. He made no concessions for her condition as a woman, expecting from her the same dedication and effort he would have expected from any apprentice. And Sarah responded with a determination that surprised even herself. Her hands, already accustomed to hard work, developed new calluses. Her arms gained strength handling the bellows and the hammer, but it was her spirit that experienced the most profound transformation. Each blow on the anvil seemed to release a fragment of the pain that had accompanied her since Daniel's death. Each spark that jumped at the contact of the hammer with the incandescent metal illuminated a dark corner of her soul. The room Marcus had given her was small but cozy. A narrow bed, a table with a wash basin, a trunk for her scarce belongings. On the wall Sarah had hung Daniel's photograph, not as a reminder of what was lost, but as a sigil, to witness to her process of rebirth. At night, when work ceased and the workshop fell silent, Marcus and Sarah shared the table in the small adjoining kitchen. At first, conversations were scarce, limited to practical matters about the next day's work. But gradually, like metal that softens under constant heat, the barriers between them began to dissolve. Marcus told her about his childhood in Georgia, the years of slavery under a master who considered literacy among slaves a crime punishable by the whip. He spoke of how he had learned to read in secret, by the light of stolen candles, and how that knowledge had been his first form of interior freedom. "A free mind is the first step toward a free body," he told her one night. As they shared a rabbit stew he had hunted himself, Sarah listened attentively, discovering in Marcus's words echoes of her own history of loss and survival. Despite the evident differences in their origins and experiences, there existed between them a mutual understanding that didn't need to be named. One afternoon, While Sarah hammered a horseshoe with the concentration of one who finds in physical work a refuge against painful thoughts, Marcus watched her from the workshop door. "You have aptitude for this," he commented, approaching to examine the piece. "Your hands seem to understand the metal." Sarah lifted her gaze, surprised both by the compliment and by the sudden closeness. For the first time she noticed the small scars that dotted Marcus's forearms, silent witnesses of years dedicated to the craft. "Metal is honest," she responded. "It hides nothing. It's strong or weak, useful or useless, and everything depends on how it's worked." Marcus nodded, a smile barely suggested on his lips. "Like people," he added, before returning to his own work. That night Sarah remained awake longer than usual, contemplating Daniel's photograph in the penumbra of her room. For the first time since his death, the pain of loss coexisted with a new, disconcerting sensation, the possibility of a future different from what she had imagined. The small clock in the room marked 10 when someone knocked on the workshop door. It was Sunday, a day when the blacksmith shop remained closed, but a blacksmith's services were sometimes required in emergency situations that didn't respect calendars. Marcus, who was reading by the window taking advantage of the morning light, stood up to attend. Sarah, seated at the table with a cup of coffee, heard the voice that, even after months, provoked in her a shiver of repulsion. "I need to speak with the widow Martinez," Victor Blackwell demanded, with the arrogance of one accustomed to being obeyed. "I know she's here." Marcus maintained his firm posture on the threshold, blocking the entrance with his sturdy body. "The lady doesn't receive visitors today," he responded, his voice calm but inflexible. Sarah stood up, leaving the cup on the table. Initial fear had given way to an indignation that impelled her to advance toward the door. "It's all right, Marcus," she said, placing a hand on the blacksmith's shoulder in a gesture that denoted confidence. "I can speak with him." Victor observed her with a mixture of surprise and discomfort. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the helpless widow who had abandoned the ranch months ago. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that had replaced the rigid mourning, and her hair, gathered in a practical braid, framed a face that had recovered color and determination. "Mrs. Martinez," Victor greeted, removing his hat with a forced courtesy. "I see you've found accommodation." The insinuating tone made Sarah press her lips. She knew too well the rumors that must be circulating through town about her situation with Marcus. "What do you want, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked directly, avoiding falling into his game of provocations. Victor cleared his throat, visibly disconcerted by Sarah's attitude. "I've been reconsidering our last conversation," he began, casting a disdainful look toward Marcus, who maintained a prudent distance but remained attentive. "Circumstances have changed, of course, but perhaps we could reach a new agreement about the ranch." Sarah felt something stir inside her. For months, she had dreamed of recovering the Martinez ranch, of honoring Daniel's memory by keeping alive the fruit of his work. But now, faced with the possibility, she discovered that her feelings were more complex than she had imagined. "The ranch no longer belongs to me," she finally responded. "You yourself made that clear." Victor balanced on his heels, uncomfortable under Sarah's direct gaze. "Properties change hands, ma'am, and agreements can be renegotiated." Sarah then understood the true motive for the visit. It wasn't generosity nor remorse that had brought Victor to her door, but necessity. Perhaps the ranch wasn't as profitable as he had hoped, or maybe it was something else he was seeking. "My answer remains the same," Sarah declared with a firmness that surprised even herself. "There is no possible deal between us." Victor's expression hardened, revealing for an instant the rage that bubbled beneath his facade of civility. "You should reconsider," he warned, his voice descending to an almost threatening tone. "This arrangement you have here won't last forever, and when it ends, what will you have left? Nothing." Marcus took a step forward, but Sarah stopped him with a subtle gesture. This was her battle, and she had to fight it with her own weapons. "I'll have my dignity. Mr. Blackwell, something you can neither buy nor sell." Victor put on his hat, his face a mask of barely contained contempt. "Dignity doesn't feed. Mrs. Martinez, remember that when winter comes." With those words, he turned on his heels and mounted his horse, riding away in a whirlwind of dust and resentment. Sarah remained on the threshold, watching as the figure that had represented the face of her fears for so long rode away. "He'll return," Marcus commented, standing beside her. Sarah nodded. She knew too well men like Victor, incapable of accepting a rejection, especially from those they considered inferior. "And he'll find us prepared," she responded, returning to the interior of the house that, without realizing it, she had begun to consider her home. Summer gave way to an autumn of coppery hues and temperate winds. The blacksmith shop prospered, in part thanks to Sarah's innate talent for the design of decorative pieces that complemented Marcus's more functional work. What had begun as a temporary refuge gradually transformed into an undeclared but effective partnership. "Stone and ironworks," Marcus suggested one afternoon, as they contemplated the new sign they had commissioned for the workshop's facade. Sarah smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth at the implicit recognition in those words. "Iron," she repeated, savoring the sound of the word. Sarah Iron. Sounds better than Martinez or O'Brien. It was a spontaneous decision, born from a deeper reflection than she herself understood at that moment. By adopting the name of the material she now molded with her hands, Sarah symbolized her own transformation. She was no longer the orphan girl nor the disconsolate widow. She was a woman who had forged herself in the fire of adversity. Marcus observed her with an intensity that made Sarah avert her gaze, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of the moment. "It suits you well," he approved, with that economy of words that characterized him. The new sign was installed the following week, and with it came a constant flow of orders that kept both busy from dawn until well into the afternoon. They worked in perfect synchrony, each anticipating the other's needs without the need for words. One night, while dining in the small kitchen, illuminated by the golden light of an oil lamp, Marcus handed her a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth. "I made it for you," he explained, with a shyness improper of a man of his bulk. Sarah unwrapped the gift to discover a small forged iron brooch, worked with surprising delicacy. It represented a 5-petaled flower, symbol of renewal in many cultures. "It's beautiful," she murmured, genuinely moved by the detail. Marcus shrugged as if downplaying his work, but satisfaction shone in his dark eyes. "Iron can be beautiful, not just useful," he commented, in what seemed a reflection as much about the material as about those who worked it. Sarah pinned the brooch to her dress, feeling the comforting weight of the metal against her chest. It was more than an ornament. It was a symbol of everything she had gained when she believed she had lost everything. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Sarah recognized the feelings that had been growing inside her, like embers fed by a constant breath. It wasn't the overwhelming passion she had felt for Daniel in her youth, but something deeper, more subdued but no less intense. A connection based on mutual respect, silent understanding, admiration for each other's strength. But along with recognition also came fear. Did she betray Daniel's memory by allowing another man to occupy a space in her heart? And what would the townspeople think, already suspicious of her association with Marcus? Daniel's photograph seemed to observe her from the small table, silent witness to her internal debate. Sarah extended her hand toward it, tracing with her fingers the outline of the face she had loved. "What would you do?" she asked in a whisper, though she knew she would get no answer. Saturday dawned grey and threatening, with low clouds that promised a storm before noon. Sarah had gone early to the market, taking advantage of the first hours to get provisions before the rain forced vendors to collect their stalls. It was at the vegetable stand where she first heard the rumors. Two women, without noticing her presence, commented in low voices but perfectly audible. "Living with that black man as if they were husband and wife. Where is her decency?" Poor Daniel, turning in his grave. She barely buried him and already sought comfort in another bed. The words struck Sarah like whiplashes, but she maintained composure. It wasn't the first time she faced others' judgment, nor would it be the last. With dignity, she approached the counter and requested her purchases, forcing the gossipers to acknowledge her presence. The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by the arrival of Mrs. Wilson, former owner of the boarding house where Sarah had worked as a young woman. At 60 years old, Elizabeth Wilson remained a respected figure in the community, known both for her rectitude and fair treatment. "Sarah, dear," she greeted with genuine affection. "I've missed you at church. Pastor Johnson asked about you last Sunday." The other women moved away, but not before casting meaningful glances toward Sarah. "I've been busy with the blacksmith shop," Sarah responded, grateful for the interruption, but conscious that even the kind Mrs. Wilson probably harbored doubts about her situation. Elizabeth observed the brooch Sarah wore on her shawl, immediately recognizing the artisanal work. "Stone made it for you?" she asked with an intuition that only years can provide. Sarah nodded. Unable to lie to the woman who had taken her in when she was most vulnerable. "He's a good man," Elizabeth continued, carefully choosing her words. "And you're a good woman, Sarah. People talk because they have nothing better to do. Don't let their poisonous tongues keep you from being happy." The surprise at those words of unexpected support left Sarah momentarily speechless. Elizabeth took advantage of the silence to add in a more confidential tone, "Daniel loved you, and he would want to see you live, not just exist. Remember that." With an affectionate squeeze on the arm, Mrs. Wilson walked away, leaving Sarah immersed in thoughts that accompanied her throughout the journey back to the blacksmith shop. The rain began to fall when the workshop was already in sight, thick drops that soon turned into a furious downpour. Sarah quickened her pace, but before she could reach the protection of the porch, a firm hand grabbed her by the arm, forcing her to stop. Tom Harrison, Victor Blackwell's foreman, looked at her with a somber expression under the soaked brim of his hat. "Mrs. Martinez," he greeted without loosening his grip, "Mr. Blackwell requires your presence this afternoon at the mansion." "It's important." Sarah tried to free herself, but Harrison's fingers dug into her arm like pincers. "I have nothing to discuss with Blackwell," she responded, rain sliding down her face like artificial tears. "It's not an invitation." "Ma'am," Harrison insisted, bringing his face close to hers. "It's an order." At 6 o'clock, alone. From the blacksmith shop entrance, Marcus's voice resonated above the storm's roar. "Let her go." "Harrison," there was no explicit threat in his words, but the firmness with which they were pronounced left no room for doubt. Tom looked toward the blacksmith, who approached with determined steps and released Sarah's arm. "I'm just delivering a message," he justified, stepping back. 6 o'clock. "It'll be better for everyone if she comes." With those words, he walked away under the curtain of water, leaving Sarah trembling, but not from the cold of the rain that soaked her clothes. Marcus led her inside the workshop, where the heat of the forge created a comforting contrast with the exterior climate. Without a word, he handed her a blanket to dry off. "I won't go," Sarah declared, responding to the unformulated question that floated between them. Marcus nodded, but his worried expression revealed that he understood the implications of that decision. "Victor is not a man who accepts refusals," he commented, stoking the fire with more vigor than necessary. Sarah observed how the sparks jumped and died in the air, ephemeral but intensely bright during their brief existence. "Neither am I," she responded, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled with the certainty that her words were completely true. The storm prolonged throughout the afternoon and part of the night, with thunder that shook the window panes and lightning that illuminated the small room with ghostly flashes. Sarah and Marcus remained seated by the fire, both pretending to concentrate on their respective tasks, she mending a shirt, he polishing a piece of metal, but with senses alert to any sound that might announce the arrival of unwanted visitors. 6 o'clock passed, and then 7, without anyone knocking at the door. At 8, Marcus stood up to prepare dinner, habitual movements that acquired an almost ritual character in the forced intimacy that the storm imposed on them. "I could have gone," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence that only the crackling of the fire and the incessant pounding of rain against the roof interrupted. "To hear what he has to say, to end this once and for all." Marcus stopped stirring the stew he was preparing and looked at her intensely. "Victor isn't looking for a conversation," he responded, carefully choosing his words. "He's looking for submission." "And you're not a woman who submits." Sarah felt a wave of heat that had nothing to do with the fireplace fire. There was so much faith in Marcus's words, so much certainty about who she really was, that it was almost overwhelming. "Daniel used to say something similar," she commented, with a melancholic smile, "that I was more stubborn than a Texas mule." Marcus returned to his task, but a slight smile curved his lips under the thick mustache. "A wise man, your Daniel," he conceded. He knew how to recognize strength when he saw it. The conversation drifted to lighter topics during dinner, as if both needed that respite of normalcy before facing what they knew was inevitable. It was late at night, when the storm finally began to abate, that they heard the unmistakable sound of approaching hooves. Marcus stood up immediately. taking the rifle he always kept nearby but never ostentatiously displayed. Sarah felt her heart accelerate, but there was no fear in that reaction, only the natural adrenaline at the proximity of a long-expected confrontation. The knocks on the door were as forceful as they were predictable. Marcus and Sarah exchanged a meaningful look before he approached to open, keeping the rifle discreetly at his side. Victor Blackwell, soaked and furious, burst into the room, followed by Tom Harrison and two other men Sarah didn't recognize, but whose appearance left little doubt about their nature. Gunmen hired for occasions that required more than intimidation. "You've made me look like an idiot." "Woman," Victor spat, completely ignoring Marcus. "I waited for you for 2 hours." Sarah remained serene, conscious that any show of weakness would be interpreted as an advantage by Blackwell. "I don't remember accepting your invitation," she responded, and the calm of her voice seemed to infuriate Victor even more. "Invitation?" he repeated with disdain. "You don't need an invitation to present yourself before your future husband." The declaration, as absurd as it was unexpected, left Sarah momentarily speechless. Marcus took a step forward, but one of the gunmen moved his hand to his revolver in a warning gesture. "You've lost your mind, Blackwell," Marcus intervened, his voice controlled but with a dangerous edge. "This woman doesn't belong to you." Victor directed a look full of contempt at him. "Stay out of this, blacksmith." "This is between the widow and me," Sarah recovered her voice, feeling indignation replace initial astonishment. "There is nothing between us, Mr. Blackwell, nor will there ever be," Victor smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes and that revealed more threat than humor. "Everything has a price." "Sarah," he declared, using her first name for the first time in an attempt to establish an intimacy she viscerally rejected. "Even freedom, especially freedom." From his jacket he extracted an envelope that he threw on the table. Sarah didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Probably more documents, more debts, more invisible chains with which he intended to bind her. "I'm not interested in your papers," she declared, pushing the envelope aside with a dismissive gesture. "I already told you there's no possible deal between us." Victor's smile vanished, giving way to a calculating expression that was even more disturbing. "And if the deal included your friend's freedom?" he asked, pointing to Marcus with a movement of his head. "A black man with a prosperous business awakens many envies. It would be a shame if some unfortunate accident—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah had jumped up, confronting him with a fur that emerged from the depths of her being. "Enough!" she exclaimed, and her voice resonated in the small room with the authority of one who has discovered her own power. "Leave our house right now. Our house." The words floated between them, charged with a meaning that went beyond simple cohabitation under the same roof. Victor stepped back, surprised by the transformation of the woman he had believed docile and manipulable. Before he could recover, Marcus was at his side, the rifle not pointing directly at the intruders, but visible enough to constitute a warning. "You've heard the lady," he said, and in his voice there was a calm that contrasted with the tension of the moment. "It's time to leave." For an instant that seemed to stretch to infinity, the future hung by a thread as fine as that which separated a finger from a trigger's fatal pressure. But it was Tom Harrison, with the pragmatism of one who knows the limits of useful violence, who intervened. "Let's go, boss," he suggested, his gaze evaluating the situation with the coldness of a professional. "It's not worth it." Victor hesitated, his pride fighting against his survival instinct. Finally, reason prevailed. "This isn't finished," he warned, collecting the envelope Sarah had rejected. "No one defies me and goes unpunished." With those words, he turned on his heels and left the house, followed by his men. The sound of horses riding away under the persistent rain was received by Sarah and Marcus, with a silence charged with contained emotions. When they finally looked at each other, something had changed between them. An invisible barrier had broken, leaving exposed a truth that both had intuited but hadn't dared to name. "Our house," Marcus repeated, his voice barely a murmur. Sarah nodded, feeling a weight lift from her chest, as if she had been holding her breath for months without realizing it. "Our house," she confirmed, and extended a hand toward him, a simple gesture but charged with unspoken promises. Marcus took it between his, large and rough from work, but infinitely gentle in their contact. There were no additional words, they weren't necessary. In the silent language they had developed, That gesture contained an entire universe of meanings. Spring arrived in Hill Station with an explosion of colors and aromas, as if nature wanted to compensate for the long months of winter gray. The fields were covered with wildflowers, and the trees in the small central park proudly exhibited their new foliage of intense green. Sarah contemplated this rebirth from the workshop window, feeling that something similar was occurring within her. Winter had been hard, not only because of the inclement climate, but because of the constant tension after the confrontation with Victor. Every nocturnal noise, every unknown customer who entered the blacksmith shop, awakened the alert of a possible attack that never materialized. But as the days lengthened and the sun gained strength, fear gave ground to a cautious hope. Rumors about Victor indicated he had suffered important economic setbacks, losing part of his lands in gambling and failed businesses. His influence in the county diminished at the same speed that his whiskey consumption increased. The blacksmith shop, meanwhile, prospered. Sarah's designs, increasingly refined and original, attracted orders even from neighboring towns. Stone and Iron Works had established itself as a respectable business, and although some continued to look with suspicion at the association between a white woman and a black man, most had ended up accepting that strange couple as part of the local landscape. The relationship between Sarah and Marcus had evolved as well, with the naturalness of the inevitable. There were no grand declarations nor dramatic moments, only small daily gestures that wove between them an increasingly deep bond. A casual touch when passing a tool, a prolonged look over the table during dinner, a hand seeking the other in the darkness when thunder shook the house. That April morning, while Sarah organized the new designs for decorative fittings that had been commissioned for the church, Marcus entered the workshop with an expression she had learned to recognize as a prelude to important news. "They've seen Victor at the bank," he informed, leaning on the doorframe. "They say he's selling everything he has left." Sarah left the drawings on the table, processing the information. The news should have relieved her, but a part of her, the one that had learned to distrust apparently favorable turns, remained alert. "And the ranch?" she asked, referring to the Martinez ranch that Victor had confiscated and that, according to what they knew, he had been using mainly as pasture for his cattle. Also for sale, apparently. A reflective silence settled between them. Sarah felt a pang of nostalgia, thinking about the property where she had lived her years with Daniel, where they had dreamed together of a future that drought and illness brutally truncated. "We could buy it," Marcus suggested. With that capacity of his to read Sarah's unexpressed thoughts, "Business is going well." "With a loan from the bank?" Sarah shook her head, surprised by her own reaction. 6 months ago, she would have given anything to recover the ranch. Now the idea of returning to that life seemed strangely alien to her. "The ranch belongs to the past," she finally responded, returning to her designs. "And I'm no longer the same person who lived there." Marcus approached, studying the intricate patterns Sarah had drawn for the church door fittings. Floral motifs intertwined with geometric forms, in a perfect balance between delicacy and strength, reflecting the very evolution of their creator. "Sarah Iron," he murmured, using the name she had adopted, and that now appeared alongside his on the blacksmith shop sign. "It suits you well," she smiled, recognizing in those simple words much more than a casual observer could perceive. Her new name wasn't only a commercial identification, it was the affirmation of an identity forged in the fire of adversity, tempered by pain and molded by her own hands. "We're going to need help with these orders," she commented, pointing to the pile of requests accumulating on the counter. "Perhaps we should look for an apprentice," Life continued, "not as a repetition of the past, nor as an escape forward, but as a constant transformation. Like iron that, under the right hands, can become something beautiful and enduring." The sunset tinted the sky purple and gold when Sarah finished forging the last piece of the day, a small decorative key that would crown the main door of the newly renovated church. It wasn't a functional element, but symbolic, representing access to both a physical and spiritual refuge. She contemplated her work with satisfaction as she submerged the metal in water, producing a cloud of steam that rose like a liberated spirit. The characteristic hiss of hot iron in contact with cold liquid was a sound she had come to love, a kind of song that marked the definitive transformation of the material. Marcus had gone out to deliver an order to a nearby farm, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the hypnotic rhythm of work. Sarah enjoyed these moments of creative solitude, when her hands and mind worked in perfect harmony, without haste or interruptions. On the workshop wall, illuminated by the amber light of the forge, now hung a framed photograph, Daniel Martinez, with his frank smile and his eyes that seemed to look beyond time. Beside it, another more recent image showed Sarah and Marcus in front of the blacksmith shop, serious as the photographic protocol demanded, but with a gleam in their gaze that not even the rigidity of the pose could hide. It wasn't a contradiction, but a continuity. Sarah had understood throughout these 2 years that the human heart possesses an infinite capacity to expand. Loving Marcus didn't diminish what she had felt for Daniel. On the contrary, it honored it by demonstrating that his teachings of respect and courage remained alive in her. The memory of Victor Blackwell now appeared in her mind as a blurred figure, almost unreal. News about his fall from grace had been confirmed. Ruined and abandoned by those who once flattered him, he had departed westward, probably to try to rebuild his fortune in territories where his name wasn't tainted. The Martinez ranch had been acquired by a family of farmers who, according to reports, were having good harvests after years of barren land. Sarah placed the finished key on the work table, admiring the reflections that light drew from its polished surface. Of all the orders received, this one was special, not so much for its monetary value, but for what it represented: the community's acceptance, recognition of her talent, the possibility of contributing something beautiful and lasting to a place that had once judged her. The sound of the door opening announced Marcus's return. Sarah didn't need to turn to recognize his steps, firm but respectful even with the ground they trod. She had learned to identify his presence by small details: the rhythm of his breathing, the slight aroma of leather and metal that accompanied him, the way the air seemed to vibrate differently when he entered a room. "It's finished," she announced, pointing to the key. "We'll deliver it tomorrow." Marcus approached to examine the piece, his fingers lightly brushing Sarah's work with the reverence of one who appreciates both the process and the result. "Perfect," he declared, and in that single word there was a world of admiration that no elaborate discourse could surpass. Sarah smiled, conscious of the heat that rose up her neck at the compliment. After all this time, after all they had lived together, Marcus still retained the power to make her blush like a girl. "There's something else I want to show you," he said, taking a small object from his pocket wrapped in a cloth. Sarah took it with curiosity. Upon unwrapping it, she discovered a simple but beautiful ring, forged in iron and decorated with a delicate floral motif she recognized as her own. It was one of her first designs, one she had drawn almost distractedly during the days when she was learning the craft. "I kept it," Marcus explained, with a mixture of pride and shyness. "I knew that someday it would be perfect." Sarah felt something expand in her chest, a warmth that radiated from the center of her being to the tips of her fingers. It wasn't the first time she had experienced that sensation, but it had never been so intense, so complete. "It's beautiful," she murmured, unable to find more eloquent words to express what she felt. Marcus took the ring from her open palm and held it between his fingers, the implicit question in his dark eyes. It wasn't necessary to formulate the question aloud. Both knew that in many states, what they were contemplating was illegal, that the outside world would look at their union with disapproval, even with hostility, that the path wouldn't be easy, but they also knew that some things are worth the fight, that love, like well-forged iron, can withstand pressures that would break weaker materials. Sarah extended her left hand, a silent but unequivocal invitation. Marcus slipped the ring on her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been created specifically for her. In a way it had. There were no elaborate vows nor grandiose promises. They weren't necessary between two people who had learned to communicate in the language of mutual respect, of trust earned day by day, of love built with patience and perseverance. Outside, the last ray of sun vanished on the horizon, giving way to a twilight of purple hues. Inside the workshop, the forge light continued burning, constant and warm, illuminating two figures who remained together, their silhouettes projected against the wall like a single elongated shadow. Sarah Iron had found her place in the world. It wasn't the one she had imagined, nor the one society would have designated for her. It was the one she had forged with her own hands, blow by blow, day by day, transforming pain into strength and iron into art. Like the metal that gave her her name, she had passed through fire to emerge stronger, more defined, more authentically herself, and that, perhaps, was true freedom.